great pleasure to introduce Mary Jo Iozzio as the final speaker for this year's Institute. She's the reason we're here. The first reason we're here, because I knew her and have known her for a long time. She's been very active in the AAR-SBL Disability Interest Network, and I think probably one of the pioneers in that group and helping that to happen. And I've met her at some AAR-SBL meetings when I've been tagging along with my wife to go to those meetings and going to some of those sessions. And we've met at some other places as well. She teaches here in the School of Theology and Ministry, Ethics and Theology. I said to Carmo, who was here from Portugal this week, hope you've met her. Carmo came in, she said the first thing, I'm not sure there are any other Catholics here. Well, we learned on Monday there were a bunch of Catholics here and around, but I said, for sure, you're gonna have to meet Mary Jo Iozzio. Mary Jo is known as a great teacher. She happens to love dogs. She happens to wander around offices looking for candy jars, and is a person who, with a lot of dedicated interest to this area. She has a book in process with Baylor Press, which I'm really looking forward to, called Radical Dependence, which has something to say, I think, about the fact that independence is mostly an illusion of our making. So help me welcome Mary Jo Iozzio to this stage.
Thank you all, and I really do appreciate the invitation to be here with you. Unfortunately, this is my very first attendance at the meeting, so I'm really glad to be here with you, and shame on me for all these many years not being able to do it. It coincides so often with other academic responsibilities that I have, other organizations, but that's beside the point. What I want to do here is make sure that I can get my text up. Return, that's what I have to push next. I did it wrong. I always do. Return. Okay, there it is. Thank you. I am really honored to be here with you, every single one of you. And I look forward to any conversations we might have after my presentation. I'll just get started. The number of scholars in the humanities, inclusive of theology, has grown from a small group of folks involved with our subject matter as a person with disability or as a parent, sibling, friend, ally, and/or caregiver. Further, international bodies have turned to the expertise of persons with disability to affirm disability as a universal human experience. Yes, this term has the potential to instrumentalize disability, but not for untoward purposes. Rather, with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, 2006, and the WHO's International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, the lessons learned include disability wisdom. They consider disability as a universal human experience, and as many of us know, a continuum of functioning and either currently experience or are vulnerable to experiencing disability over the course of our lifetimes. We know that in our bones, to borrow Julia Botts-Belzer's words. This understanding of disability is the key to mainstreaming disability within the public discourse. Consider the move on the part of the Center for Disease Control's efforts to increase the number of people dedicated to being an ally. This is a new initiative on the part of the CDC. The CDC uses its platform to promote inclusion of persons with disability in all arenas of human commerce. The acronym ALLY, ally, follows many of our initiatives to A, acknowledge and respect individual experiences and abilities, L, learn about different disability types, L, leverage your influence to promote accessibility and inclusion. And Y, yield the floor to people with disabilities to help identify and eliminate barriers. Isn't that a terrific last? Right? Congratulations, CDC. Sometimes they get it right. They must have had some of you on their committees. One would hope, right? One would hope. Recent work on disability runs in the thousands of articles and hundreds of books published in the US and abroad. This is a prolific community of scholars. A prolific community of scholar teachers, a prolific community of scholar activists. We are, each of us, activists in this work. I've been working in this field since 1994, the year that Nancy Eastland's The Disabled God Toward a Liberatory Theology of Disability was published, and I have not turned back. For many of us, many others, Eastland's work remains the touchstone in theological investigations of the experience of disability through the lens of faith traditions, openness to, or failure to welcome persons with disability in all places, secular and religious, all places where people gather to pray, to learn, to teach, to play, to eat and drink, and to work. These texts have been published in the past 5 years, texts I'm going to be looking at, that we'll be discussing. They've been published in the past 5 years, and they focus on a specific set of concerns from Bill Gaventa's spirituality text, Aaron Rafferty's justice work, Devin Stahl's modern genetics works, and eugenics and metaphysics, to Julia Watts-Belzer's disability wisdom, to Lisa Powell's revisit of Eastland's work. Right, 30 years ago, Eastland. These contributions and many others approach the subject with a view toward greater or better or full access to the commons and the academy for people with disability. Disability fluency begins with recognition of persons with disability, followed by a stroll through time, from ancient of days to today, so as to present a history riddled with erasure and abuse, alongside the presence and the contributions that many people with disability have made to their families and the communities where they lived, learned, loved, played, and shared their genius. In spite of a growing awareness of exclusion and oppressions imposed on people from non-dominant communities throughout history, exclusions and oppressions persist for many and are compounded by ethnicity, racial, gender, diversity, and disability. Add intersectionality to these identities, and the likelihood of violence against them increases exponentially. Sadly, neither discrimination nor abuse are unfamiliar to members of these communities. Both abuse and the failure to recognize their inherent dignity must be exposed as sin. Discrimination against and abuse of others must be challenged whenever and wherever it manifests. There is hope that conscientization of the experience of abuse and remedies to the individual and/or collective victims can be remedied by awareness and repair of the breach. Today, disability justice movements can be found across the globe. Arguably, the movement started in England before these instruments were conceived and, unsurprisingly, quickly made its way to North America. Others have argued that awareness moved in a vein of transnational politics and is comprehensive of socio-political understandings of disability as a significant part of the work of disability justice. In general, the discipline has developed nomenclature to identify models that operate to define the what of this or that disability. You know this. The medical model identifies disability as a disease, inherently abnormal or pathological. The moral religious model presumes disability as a consequence of sin, one's own or of another. The social model locates the ease or difficulty of access to all manner of human commerce in the structures that prevent participation. These models and others provide a vocabulary to identify an appropriate response to understand the many contours of disability experience. Even so, we are here for theological explorations about why disability matters for, number one, all the people who have an intimate relationship with the kaleidoscopic diversity of ourselves. Two, all those who blithely navigate the world without a thought of themselves or our siblings by either ignorance or naivete. And three, next steps for the discipline of disability theology. We do this work to teach, to enlighten, and to increase the yardage of accessibility for our body, mind, spirit to be whole and holy thereby. We do this work as disability justice for all because it is right and good. We do this work to expose past failures and ongoing oppressions of persons with disability and members of other marginalized communities whose intersectional identities place them at greater risk of harm. And we do this work in gratitude for our companioning together on the journey called life. In what follows, I offer a commentary on recent work in disability theology. Bill Gaventa's Disability and Spirituality, Recovering Wholeness, Aaron Rafferty's From Inclusion to Justice, Disability Ministry and Congregational Leadership, Devin Stahl's Disability Challenge to Theology, Genes, Eugenics, and the Metaphysics of Modern Medicine, Julia Watts-Belzer's Loving Our Bones, Disability Wisdom and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole, and Lisa Powell's The Disabled God Revisited, Trinity, Christology, and Liberation. So Gaventa begins disability and spirituality with a simple truth. People with disabilities are human beings. They are our friends, coworkers, companions, children, and ourselves, working out together our individual and community identities and values, connections, and sense of purpose and calling. The desires of community and inclusion resonate in all people. We are made for one another in the same imago Dei. He argues that we would do well to recognize that spirituality is both a central dimension of human experience and a wellspring of support for the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties, the dreams, for healing, for repair and improvement of the world. In Jewish terms, tikkun olam. Unfortunately, ableism reckons that disability is a mistake, and far too many people think it's better to have not been born or to be dead. Moreover, God declared that God declared that all of creation is good, no exceptions. People with disabilities and those without are good, and each bears the sacred title ascribed to humankind, that is, the Imago Dei. Like the non-disabled, people with disability have rights to independence, equal in scale to the non-disabled, to productivity, not necessarily in capitalist measures, to inclusion in the main, to self-determination, and to cultural competence. People with disability ask the same questions of their place in the world as the non-disabled. Who am I? Why am I? To whom do I belong? How will I exercise my hopes and realize my dreams? These questions are key to spirituality, which Gaventa defines as identity, connection, and purpose by knowing and valuing the other before us. This spirituality does not abide in patronizing approach of praise to either the person with disability or to their caregiver or caregivers. Rather, this spirituality empowers the individual with disability. The assumptions that some or many, we might likely think, some or many non-disabled people have run the gamut from, their assumptions have run the gamut from ridiculous to harmful. The ridiculous is shrub-worthy, but the harmful is critical to stop. From questions about whose sin or wrongdoing is responsible for the disability in your life, the person with disability or their parents must be guilty of some sin, or to praise for the parents or the person with disability in their heroism. You go, girl, right? But yes, you go, girl. Unfortunately, the tropes and stereotypes from pity to pathetic to super crip, sinister, and better off dead remain demeaning. What many non-disabled people forget is that the needs and dependency of people with disability are akin to the non-disabled. What are they? The quality of life inclusive of belonging, for example, in the common activities in a faith community, in recreation, friendships, neighborhood and school connections, and storytelling. Ever practical in his concerns for the reader, Gaventa covers the development of a material and spiritual lifespan with transitions from childhood to death. As children with disabilities grow into teenagers and adults, change is afoot. However, regardless of disability status, both young adults and parents may need a variety of supports in the process of taking on new identities, losing, adding, or altering community relationships, and developing both the personal focus and the skills related to purpose and direction. Here, what Bill is taking up is for persons who have been in institutional care, not necessarily residential, but in institutional care, as the individual grows, ages, there will be different kinds of supports necessary through the aging process. The same is true of the non-disabled. Right? We have our children in kindergarten first, or maybe daycare, then kindergarten, then grade school, high school, maybe college, vocational school, whatever it might be. We have these same things, but when it comes to disability, oh, no, I can't figure out what to do here. You figure it out the same way you figure it out with any child, with every child. It takes a village, such as the congregation, that could accommodate the change to adulthood with integrity, care, and explorations of the opportunities for the young adult to work while maintaining relationships in the community. However, in whatever way each has matured. Dependencies on others will wane and self-determination will be ever more incrementally available in adulthood, but relationships continue. They must. The paradox here is embracing and managing our inherent dependence while trying to remain the authors of our own story. Do we give our siblings with intellectual and developmental disabilities opportunities to tell their story, to write their story, to sing their story? From here, Gaventa moves to loss that accompanies the deaths of family members, friends, and one's own life. Care must be taken in preparing persons with disabilities that is equal to, if not better than, preparations for the able-minded, able-bodied. Gaventa's advice is wise. Both preparation during the time of demise and accompaniment for the mourning of a loved one must be provided, and honored for as long a time as the mourner needs. We all mourn at our own pace. When Gaventa returns to spirituality specifically, he focuses on families and their need from time to time of professional and neighborly supports. He offers core components for family, clergy, friends, and other professionals to engage. Ideally, these professionals and friends are known to the family. These supports include the practical matters of navigating the healthcare system and acknowledging what services are available, connecting with other families, and navigating the day-to-day needs alongside the short and long-term planning. As faith communities recognize spirituality as part of the package of holistic care. However, non-religious affiliated professional care practice has often shied away from spirituality for fear of breaking the divisions between church and state. But holistic care is patient-centered care, and for many individuals and their families, spirituality informs their being such that it ought not to be denied in the intimacy of care, understood as sitting with a trusted other when areas of vulnerability, deep personal values, and beliefs are being explored. To make this principle of care more palatable, it can be understood as one of the principles of the art that is medical care. Beneficence ought not only to be thought of as the contrary to do no harm, but as a vocational spirituality of care. Gaventa argues further that meaning is found in the vocational calls to health care that healthcare workers receive and practice on a par with ministerial practice. Along with others writing on disability, Bill turns explicitly to the ways that spirituality grounds friendship. He identifies three basic elements of friendship: companions who accept one another with all our quirks and gifts, as you are, mutuality and reciprocity, and in a shared commitment to the values that form the foundation of a good life or a good society. From Plato to Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Francis Bacon, and Montaigne of the past to contemporary virtue theorists Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Alistair McIntyre, Stanley Hauerwas, James Keenan, and others. The good life is a life well lived. Such living requires the company of others, the company of friends. As dependent, rational beings, our Constitution requires the presence and support of family, friends, and others for personal and social communion. Reciprocal in both nature and the biblical tradition, Gaventa argues that friendship and love play out in the hospitality offered to neighbors and strangers. Unfortunately, both hospitality and hospital and home care settings are riddled with bureaucracy that restrict caregiver and patient interactions with injunctions against friendship that the organization fears, sometimes rightly, might develop into inappropriate or criminal behavior against vulnerable others. Gaventa concludes his text with practical theological trajectories to consider. Recognize, for example, that welcome, belonging, and participation are rights belonging to all people. Be mindful, however, that ignorance or fear of the other block the awareness of connection, common values, and shared purpose on which any sense of community depends. Further, as we know from diversity awareness training programs, the arc of justice, inclusive of these principles, resembles the rainbow, the bend that bends to justice. As a matter of international, national, and natural law, justice includes giving to all others what is due, respect for their dignity, self-determination, a self and welcoming community, opportunities for participation and to thrive. Past practices that segregated people with disabilities from the main are no longer acceptable, as well as not up to the legal code in public places like the church, the school, or the workplace. Further, complacency in the face of exclusion, the failure to welcome the stranger, however the stranger is defined, the withholding the good that is due by virtue of one's being is an insult against the imago Dei. It is sin. The antidote to this posture is a welcoming community as it responds with grace to all who enter. I turn now to Aaron Rafferty's work. Rafferty begins from inclusion to justice with the simple premise that disability is not a problem, but a dignified, incarnate human experience through which God is at work, but wherein our thinking and practice at the congregational level is still steeped in societal prejudice toward disabled people. Ableism is the norm to which people are compared, a norm that has segregated disabled people and persons from other marginalized communities without recognizing the multiple intersections of our identities or of our equal status as the imago Dei. Hegemonic ableist normativity must give way to inclusion of all members of the human community. Because if we live in a world where ableism reinforces capitalism, whiteness, and heteronormativity, without decolonization from these forces, there can be no justice. We're still in the process of decolonizing. Far too much. Further, if justice is giving to others what is due, that's the technical definition from Aristotle. If justice is giving to others what is due, how is it that disabled people remain assigned to the peripheries? They're not due to the peripheries, they're due to the center. in this space, in all space. Each of the chapters of Rafferty's text begins with a scripture passage, which I delighted in. She's not the only one that's done that in this presentation. She unpacks the scripture passage as an added value for her project. She opens the first chapter, the problem of inclusion, with Jesus' healing of the blind Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10. You know the story. Bartimaeus cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Master, let me receive my sight." This pericope illustrates Jesus' readiness to hear and respond to the needs of those who ask. He does not presume what Bartimaeus wants. Rather, Jesus lets Bartimaeus speak for himself, as well as welcomes him into the community of both his disciples and his ministry. Right? He gets healed of his blindness, and then he becomes a disciple throughout the rest of Jesus' ministry, and presumably beyond with the apostles and the other disciples. This welcome is not an accommodation on Jesus' part. It is empowerment. The question Bartimaeus raises is not just whether the church will have ears to listen or sight to see, it's whether the church will throw down its cloak and pursue Jesus alongside Bartimaeus. Similarly, Rafferty considers Jesus at the Pharisees' house for the Sabbath. When Rafferty engages Jesus' radical appreciation of the Sabbath, especially for those who must labor even on the day of rest, in reference to healing a man with dropsy on the holy day, unyoking the beast of burden, and the caution of taking seats at the seats of distinction at a banquet when you do not know the seat that the host has provided for you, planned for you. She finds today's experiences unchanged from these same scenes. Beyond this hegemony, possibilities remain to rehabilitate what appears to be yet another instrumentalist reading of those who are healed and presumably rehabilitated into their communities. As liberation theology has argued, the banquet invitation to the poor and the disabled is the restoration of everyone's access to what belongs rightly to everyone. This is a subversive critique of unexamined and unchecked power. As Rafferty argues, we need to move beyond inclusion. Her book is Beyond Inclusion to Justice. We need to move beyond inclusion of persons with disabilities to actually listen to them for their directions and to follow their recommendations on how to welcome them into our churches and our hearts. In Jesus' visit to the house of Martha and Mary, Rafferty finds an example of listening to another's story alongside busying oneself with the practical work of ministry. You know the story. Martha is busy doing the hospitality thing, and Mary's just sitting at Jesus' feet. Martha attends to the practicalities of hospitality while Mary sits, attentive to him as a disciple. She's the first of the women disciples. Clearly, Jesus' mother would be there too, but there's so many Marys in our stories. Mary listens, not to deny the importance and the practicalities of meal preparation and presentation, but if nothing else, ministry begins with listening to those who we love and serve. How do we know what you need if we do not ask and if we do not listen and genuinely hear and then plot together how to relieve that need? Such sitting with disabled people and their families witnesses to their joys and sorrows, the injustices they experience and their lament. Such sitting requires patience and the ability to suffer with another in her, his, their distress. Jesus follows this path of justice throughout his ministry, and liberating those whom he healed, he commissioned them, go and do something now. and liberated those whom he healed. He commissioned them and us to ministry with others in prophetic commitment to repair injustice with the leadership of those deemed previously unfit to proclaim the good news. As Rafferty raises the ministry done by members of their congregations, she offers the passage from Romans 12 where Paul appeals to the one body in Christ. This one body is made up of the many members of our church, singular and plural. Here, both inclusion and participation affirm Paul's instructions to support the efforts that families, friends, and church communities engage when all are welcomed as full members of this body. Right? You probably know that song, one bread, one body, one Lord of all. We are one people, right? This one body is made up of many members. Here, both inclusion and participation affirm Paul's instructions to support the efforts that families, friends, and church communities engage when all are welcomed as full members of this body. The many prayers of this body have their function. And I'm using that word deliberately, all right? The image of God functions. Our bodies function. We are part of the body of God. We ought not to deter or refuse those whom the Spirit moves to act. Don't hush them. Right? How many times have we heard the, hush, don't talk now, be quiet, when there may be something quite profound to be heard. Liberating theology from the confines of worship rubrics allows the Spirit of God and the Spirit of the worshiping community to active participation in the praise and thanksgiving for the gifts each has received. Participation in church includes liturgical and community activities and shines especially for the inclusive congregation when the lector or presider asks, "And for whom and what else should we pray today?" All right, so that happens at my church. At the end of the regular set of printed petitions, there's a call out for, are there any other prayers? And sometimes people will say, yes, will speak their request. And it could be something like, I want my doggy to get better. Or it could be, I want my mom to feel better. Or my sister, or my brother, my friend who's having a hard time with physical, emotional, developmental pain. Thus, because disabled people faithfully demand and seek out participation, isn't that a great stretch of words? This is a quote. Because disabled people faithfully demand and seek out participation, they critically call attention to the ways in which worship is lacking, inviting congregations to to be in active pursuit of Jesus. Participatory practices and greater freedom in worship is needed. Rafferty argues that inclusion is insufficient. Right? Again, title of her book, Inclusion to Justice, From Inclusion to Justice. How will people with disability know which community to choose from, since many churches remain physically inaccessible, structurally inaccessible, and ministerially closed? In the story of the enslaved girl who had a spirit of divination, both attention to and erasure of her hold sway in exegetical work. Unfortunately, more often than not, disabled characters disappear from storylines once their disability serves its purpose. Though enslaved, this girl participates in a powerful form of mantic prophecy for a time in her life, giving her not only a type of limited authority within her sphere, but also perhaps enabling her to resist her own enslavement. This is the woman who was possessed. Rafferty is intrigued with this girl as she recognizes her cry as Mary's Magnificat that proclaims the greatness of the Lord and the way of salvation, and wonders why Paul is so intent on sending her away. She's proclaiming the good news. We can imagine that the woman continued to proclaim the goodness of the Lord. The question to ask ourselves must interrogate our own rules of decorum and silencing voices, those voices of our students, our parishioners, our friends, our family members, and even ourselves. To remedy this lack of justice, what is needed is deliberate invitation to participate in all levels of church practice, inclusive in its structure and focused on the responsibility of denominations to do justice in serving God's people, leadership by disabled people in the vein of a spirit that roars with joys and laughter as well as sorrows and laments like the wind at Pentecost. If given the chance, disabled leadership arises at no less a pace than that of the abled. And Rafferty presents numerous examples of their ministries as lectors, greeters, and community builders from which other churches could learn and implement. Further, as congregations become known for their welcome liturgically and structurally, more disabled people and the abled will come as they are. Certainly, church leaders should have familiarity with their neighborhood communities as well. If they don't, they can survey the folks in the neighborhood, to see what needs could the church provide in order to welcome them ever more increasingly into their communities. Granted, a fully welcoming church takes work and planning, especially if its clerical staff of its clerical staff, because they get very picky, apparently, about who gets to do what and when. I'm not a member of a clerical staff, or a clerical state, so I don't quite know what it's like to be so stringent in one's expectations. For those of us who are teachers, it's not that we're lowering expectations, we're trying to figure out how to make our expectations meet the needs of our students. All right, so the faculty are the ones who are responsible for things that go wrong in the classroom. A lot of folks probably wouldn't like that, my saying that, but I know when I've made a mistake and I try to apologize in a timely manner. Rafferty does offer some blueprint examples to inform both ministry and congregational practices of welcome service and accessibility for the sake of justice. I turn now to the work of Devin Stahl. At one point in my life, I was doing some science things, but all that science has been lost in my memory. Stahl brought me back to some of it. So, Disabilities Challenges to Theology. She begins her story with her book with a personal story on considerations surrounding reproductive technologies, including assistive treatments and genetic screening. The Presbyterian Church affirmed these treatment opportunities and other pregnancy concerns in 1983. Unfortunately, yet not surprisingly, the language employed in discussion of genetic anomalies exposed a medicalized rationale that presumes that genetic anomalies are unabashedly bad, and ultimately better that the person who expresses those, or the embryo or fetus that expresses those, would be better not to be born. From this start, Stahl moves to the beginnings of genetic and eugenic science and the implications of the presumptions that scholars and statespeople held concerning not the origin of the species, but the natural hierarchy of being in the world. So this establishment of hierarchies was the beginning of the classifications of race, gender, and disability that, if not Anglo or Euro, Northern European descent, you were somewhat less than fully a person, or certainly less likely to earn anything like citizenship and the rights that come with citizenship. By the end of the 18th century, racial and disability ideologies buttressed beliefs about the inferiority of both racialized and disabled peoples. A eugenic Atlantic seeked to fold disability and race into a project of human exclusion based upon scientific management systems successfully developed within modernity. Eugenics presents a disturbing picture of virulent ableism that seeks a master race of the able-bodied and, more likely, the able-minded. It was, and though cloaked today, remains a program of erasure of the non-conforming by removing them from the commons by murder, imprisonment, institutionalization, and sterilization. The point of the eugenics movement was essentially to rid the world of whom they decided were non-productive. Industrial Revolution, right? You got to produce something, you got to produce something. That became the cry of the Industrial Revolution, and it has carried on to us. You know, when we're not churning out chapters, when we're not doing presentations, you know, you're sloughing off here. Come on, get with the program. Whose program? I can only go by the pace I can go. I can only write as slow as I write. A good deal of scientific research depends on a vocabulary that supports, however, a godlike power. For example, reflecting on the first draft of the human genome, former director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, Francis Collins, admitted, and I quote, "It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God." The geneticists think they're God. They think they have God's power. That's blasphemous. Over the millennium, scholars have pondered God's relationship to the world and to ourselves. Although Aristotle did not directly engage anything like our understanding of God, he did posit the unmoved mover and the metaphysics of formal, material, efficient, and final cause of being and of doing. Aquinas brought these causes together in his work on natural law and our place in the order that God has established, our responsibilities to maintain it. The scholastics' human capacities were challenged by the Reformation's focus on the fall from grace that dogs our will and reason towards sin. As the 17th century debates between empiricists, philosophers, scientists, Pierre Gassendi and Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, and others ensued, both Aristotelian and scholastic thought began to unravel under the weight of progress. That is, in human versus God-controlled natural philosophy, with the immutable laws of nature at the helm. Stahl offers this history to situate initiatives that follow the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, its development of experimentalism, and its influence on the mechanics of social impacts of the Industrial Revolution. The 20th century witnessed new medical interventions, antibiotics, vaccinations, transplantation, IVF, prenatal genetic testing, and whatnot. It's filled with both more sophisticated and common technologies that have not necessarily improved the quality of life, but which have been inserted into nearly every facet of our being. Stahl asks, what then are we to make of today's genetic science proclivities to determine our futures and those of our progeny? We can manipulate that gene, or we can abort. Those are your choices. While genetic science offers a revolution of understanding genome function and the development and variability within all living beings, what is learned can be used for good or for ill. Nevertheless, the pathways by which our genes confer risk and the limitations inherent in liability scores highlights why genetic information is not determinative. Gene outcome associations are correlated with, and importantly, can be interrupted by environmental processes. This risk is part of the gamble that's hidden in the development of nascent life from embryo to fetus to infant. Stahl reminds us that the more we learn about genes, the more it appears genes are complex and interactional, not discrete entities that code for particular characteristics. So following both an ontological reductionism and the technological imperative, genetic research presumes something akin to a metaphysics of material and efficient causality as it ignores the formal and final cause. The technological imperative falls far short of the vocation to medical research and healthcare practice. This imperative fails the ends of the discipline. These technologies come near to a mocking stance before God, the creator of all that is on earth and beyond. The world as we know it is filled with both animate and non-animate matter created by God. Ontological status is assessed by membership in one or another community of being. Therefore, human ontological status is the personhood that belongs to the intrinsic active potentiality to God in the project of a good life, with no exceptions. A person is anyone who possesses, by virtue of their essential nature, an intrinsic active potentiality for self-consciousness, thought, autonomy, volition, and is thereby a member of the moral community. I don't think there's anyone that we know that does not have these qualities. Potentiality is the key for all persons being and doing. The ontological ground of the Imago Dei supersedes any attempt to deny another's dignity and rightful place in the human communion. Further, justice calls us to this recognition of inherent dignity, particularly toward the weakest and most marginalized members of our communities. To fail these members is to fail ourselves as the Imago Dei, as well as to fail to live and to do as God has commanded us, to love and to care for one another. The church must assert that our genes are not the essence or defining feature of who we are, and that even if genes contribute to what we are, we should not reduce all human whatness to genetics. Okay. How then are Christians to respond? Regardless of our disability status, each of us are dependent on others. This claim serves as the starting point for a new paradigm in anthropology, a paradigm of relational dependence on the diversity of being in the world, even the dependence of God's being in the world. Jesus' own body, as well as the body he created, the church, are marked by dependency and vulnerability. These are not qualities that should be shunned. Rather, they are markers of the body of Christ. Stahl reminds us that each member of this body, the church, is a gift, not to be abused or ignored, but accepted as the Imago Dei gift that each is to another in friendship and in fellowship. Thus, if God is for us, and if in Jesus that for us advocacy overflows into friendship and solidarity with humankind, then friendship and solidarity must mark, not in stigmatizing, but in liberating advocacy, each Christian and every church. Further, just as God offers friendship despite the asymmetry between creatures and God, and despite our continual infidelity to God, so too are Christians expected to offer friendship with others, regardless of their ability or willingness to reciprocate that friendship. With this posture, reflections on liturgical services and other church activities encourage us to follow this model as the standard of ecclesial practice, inclusive of liturgical agency. Julia Watts Belzer's text. This was a very fun book to read. Julia is a poet. Belzer's love story is a testament to the virtue of self-love and self-care. Without denying the lack of accommodations of many kinds for disabled people, from failures to accommodate sensory, physical, developmental, intellectual, and co-occurring disabilities, Belzer takes pride in herself. Consider her reflection on the rhythm of her childhood gait. I tried to walk right. I stretched the thick anchor of my heel cord. I practiced over and over the motion of heel before toe. But as I did my exercises night after night, I remember listening to the offbeat of my limp and loving the sound. Loving the sound of my own step. The way my foot struck the ground, the distinctive rhythm of my walk. They were my signature, something that was purely my own. End quote. With another example, she writes of an experience during the opening prayers celebrating the holiday of Shavuot, when the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel is chanted. This text presents Ezekiel's visions of God riding on a chariot with great wheels. Belzer was moved in her experience with this passage at that particular Shavuot. As while reading that description of God's defined chariot, she writes, I felt a jolt of recognition, an intimate familiarity, a whimsical sense of kinship. I thought, God has wheels. When I think of God on wheels, I think of the delight I take in my own wheelchair, the satisfaction I take from a life on wheels. She writes that ableism is by far both insidious, the most insidious and difficult obstacle, perhaps stubborn is a more apt description, to dismantle. How do we dismantle ableism? From challenges of an ableist agenda to the functional terms that affect the people under review for this or that, or these or those accommodations, disabled people are interrogated as if they were guilty of a crime. This ism is as dangerous as all others: racism, sexism, genderism. These are co-occurring isms that place disabled people at an even greater risk of grave violence. Ultimately, ableism is a sin that requires of its perpetrators repentance and a resolution to stop the violence. Disabled people are no more or less people, no more or less worthy to go where they will, and no more likely to succeed or fail as the normates in our midst. Ableism prizes productivity so thoroughly that it consumes all other values, like love and friendship, rest, play, prayer, to the detriment of all. Belzer tackles these texts of terror or of disappointment, texts of disappointment, in consideration, for example, of priestly blemishes, on Moses as disabled prophet, and on the land that Moses will not get to enter. The book of Leviticus is a rubric that follows a pattern to listen to the story, explain the story, and live the story. These rubrics point to the ways that the text continues to influence contemporary practices that, more often than not, lead to oppressions on those who seem to fail the norm. These texts can be rightly identified as texts of terror. The challenge is to either ignore or face the text. Thus, Belzer prefers to face the text of Leviticus 21 as a powerful and disturbing text, one that makes visible the dynamic by which certain bodies are marked as inferior. She writes, I take these texts as a visceral reminder of ableism. To focus on Moses' protests to God for the call to lead the people, she finds not the erasure of this disability, but God's presence in the very particulars of Moses' mouth. Remember, Moses had a speech impediment. And he protested again, don't make me talk in front of these people. I know how rowdy they are. They're going to get mean to me, and I don't want to be, all those sorts of things. Okay, you get it. She finds not the erasure of this disability, but God's presence in the very particulars of Moses' mouth, in the twist of his tongue, in the physical realities of the body God has formed for him. His impediments are not removed. Rather, Moses is accommodated with an aid. Right? We understand AIDS, AIDS, very well. Aaron, his brother, is his aide. He becomes his spokesperson. Belzer reminds us also of the precarity of the Hebrews in the land of the Egyptians. That is, the murder of innocents by Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter, Batia, her shenanigans. Moses' clever sister Miriam. Right, so Batia is the name that the Jewish community has attributed to the Pharaoh's wife's handmaid who scooped Moses out of the river, and then gave him back to his mom to breastfeed, which would have taken more than the maybe 6 or 9 months that some women today will breastfeed. This went on for a couple years, well into his 4th or 5th year, I would suspect, maybe even longer than that. So Moses' clever sister Miriam offers to find a nursemaid for the infant, his own mother, until he is weaned, after which Batia names him and raises him as her own. So the name Moses is given to Moses by the nursemaid. For the remainder of the Moses story, as told in the Mishnah, which those of us not belonging to Jewish communions would not have greater familiarity with, Belzer laments that for all intents and purposes in Moses' story, once accommodations are made, this again is in the Mishnah, once accommodations are made, his disability seems to have been erased, and oration in command, even though it's Aaron who's doing all the talking. Today we can think of other entryway refusals to places that ought to be accessible. Right? Moses was not permitted into the Promised Land. All he could do was see it from afar. Today we can think of other entryway refusals to places that ought to be accessible, but which remain defiant in matters of law as well as hospitable welcome. And Belzer does not leave out a critique of gospel texts in a visceral response to the healing narrative in the gospel story of the bent-over woman. Belzer demands the would-be healer to get your hands off my body. Right? We are in today's world, more cognizant of the power of touch to hurt as well as to heal. And persons with disability often are touched as, either the honeys of the prom or the event, or those who need to be moved out as quickly as possible. So there's this horrible distance between the ways that persons with disability have been treated then and still today. The other thing, like many disabled people, Belzer has experienced an approach of and concerns of strangers for her well-being with innocuous inquiries, unsolicited offers for help, and prayers for your healing. Perhaps mimicking Jesus, the material dynamics of solicitors' concerns. Include startling assumptions of cause or offensive claims and uninvited touch. The non-disabled seem able only to think that life is surely better without disability. Belzer engages similarly the story of a man who had been trying for 38 years to enter the healing pool. Back to a Christian story, a New Testament text. A man who'd been trying for 38 years to enter the healing pool at Bethesda, but who was denied access by others with every single attempt he tried. 38 years for want of a savior. Where is his friends? Where are his friends to ensure that he made it into the pool? And why was the pool not designed with an ingress? Today's experiences are not much different than this man's. However, cure is not the point. Rather, accommodations are the need. You know, he only needed the ramp to get into the pool. And it probably would have been soothing. Who knows what cure meant for him? Because cure directs our attention to the repair of the body or the disciplining of the mind, the dominant model of cure overlooks and obscures the transformation of social structures and attitudes. Because cure mistakes what is broken, it leaves the architecture of ableism in place. When Belzer turns to the narratives of Isaac and Jacob, she takes a no-holds-barred approach to Rebekah's and Jacob's ruse to steal the blessing owed to Esau as the firstborn son. Isaac seems to be aware that something is amiss, and yet he allows himself to be deceived, perhaps because he favored Jacob over Esau. Perhaps. Belzer admits the challenges the ruse implies for disabled people. Presented here as blind, Isaac is a tragic figure or a fool. Blindness makes him helpless. He is incompetent, a bumbler, a man who is susceptible to every trick in the book. Isaac's blindness is a prop, a way to propel the story forward. Right? How often do we know persons with disability, ourselves even, being used as props for somebody else's whatever? She's frustrated by Isaac's incompetence, in his blindness, and the loss of agency from there on. However, contra to Isaac's 20 more years of life, you know, we presumed he was, you know, already ancient of days when boys were born, or when he was giving them this blessing, but he lives another 20 years. She thinks of her counterintuitive self-demands for perfection and those of other disabled people to demonstrate an I can do this for myself attitude. Thank you very much, by the way. Keep your hands off me. Except if we live to old age, our bodies will slow, our strength will wane, our senses lose their acuity, and like Isaac, we will need the help of others. Nevertheless, Isaac's story is a breach of trust, a reminder that disability accentuates our vulnerability and the world cannot wait to take advantage of our naivete, of our vulnerability. When Belzer turns to the story of Jacob at the Jabbok, wrestling all night with an angel who dislodges his hip in the melee, the upshot of the encounter demonstrate that both Jacob's physical strength and a change in his own self-understanding occurs. From here on, Jacob will be known as Israel, a name that pins Jacob into place as the progenitor of the Jewish people, the one in whose image we seek our own spiritual journey. We are the ones who wrestle with God. Belzer resonates with Jacob's physical transformation as the result of his encounter with God. As night gives way to dawn, Jacob demands a blessing from his wrestling partner, signaling his recognition of the stranger's identity, which he describes as seeing the face of God. The wrestling between the two is settled by a night's-long wrestling bout. Following this encounter, Jacob, now Israel, will limp through the rest of his life. As Belzer engages these narratives, she unpacks a hidden liberation in the text, a liberative brilliance that breaks the normate fear and failure to wrestle. God on Wheels, in God on Wheels, she treats us to the joy she experiences in her life on her very own wheels. She recalls an experience of great joy on the celebration of a feast of Shavuot, a festival that celebrates Moses' return from Mount Sinai with the tablets of the commandments, 7 weeks after and signaling a type of Pentecost. The chariot is God's own multivalent transportation. With wheels that could move in any direction, the imagery offers a wild, provocative scene of movement and style. The whole vision is characterized by a dramatic sense of movement. Fire moves over the living creatures like burning torches. The living creatures themselves dart around like lightning, and when they move, it is in multiple directions, seemingly at the same time. God has wheels, yes, and seemingly takes delight in the chariot and the charioteers. Finally, I turn to Lisa Powell's text, The Disabled God Revisited. Powell opens the text with a confession that while she is not disabled, she lived with chronic illness as a child and adolescent, and today she mothers a neurodivergent child. She is dedicated to an intersectional disability theology through liberation theology's identification of God with the oppressed. While liberation theology has its root in Latin America, and arguably in India with Gandhi's campaign for the Dalit people, with and for the Dalit people, this theology has been taken up by people across the globe. It applies to those who are poor and or subject to the will of the dominant community. In the US, victims of oppressive dominance are Black, brown, indigenous, interracial, and disabled people. Powell's God talk points to the intersection of God's solidarity with creation, with the marginalized, and with the disabled. This theology points to conscientization as the start of the struggle for liberation and a welcome place at home, at school, at work, at play, at church. After all, God created each of us in God's own image for one another and for God. Right? You remember the title, God for Us. As Powell starts her text, she notes the many contributions of scholars dedicated to disability theology. She provides a primer of terms and the differences between impairment and disability. It's an important distinction that recognizes this or that diagnosis and or condition. That is, the medical model of disability versus the social structures that impede access and participation in the commons. The social model. Both models point to stigma such as the way society is structured and the ways cultures respond to particular body minds that create disabling conditions. She notes too what Eastland did not engage, that is intersectionality. The term was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in a 1989 essay called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination, doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. That trajectory from that one essay in 1989, Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge have now, in their second edition of a book by the title Intersectionality, highly recommended. So through no fault of Eastland's own, intersectionality is understandably absent in Eastland's work, as is attention to today's crip identity. And non-binary realities, the non-normative body minds. Regardless of this critique that Powell offers, Eastland broke the stronghold of ableism by recognizing that God's own dependency in the flesh of Jesus and the dependency of the Trinity is not foreign to who God is in God's self. Today, theology is peppered with attention to embodied and minded persons. For work in disability, this attention is key to appreciating not only persons with disability, but to appreciate as well the body of Christ and the church. In the imitation of Jesus, who cared for people in their bodies, their hunger, their sickness, and their material poverty, so are Christians to do. The physical nature of Jesus' own ministry is not an add-on. It is central to both doctrine and the incarnation, both the doctrine of the incarnation and the disabled risen God of faith. Powell moves to a Barthian lens to present a doctrine of God that coheres with a full Trinitarian choice to create the world as we know it, to covenant with creation, and to incarnate in bone and flesh. Powell argues convincingly that God's eternal being is and was always directed to incarnation as a tri-ordered life of God from the beginning. Here she takes the opportunity to address God's vulnerabilities seriously as she engages the disabled God. In Jesus, God is ontologically receptive and eternally determined to receive the experience of humanity into God's life, a comprehensive solidarity with humankind. She then turns to the kenosis to uncover ontological reality, the ontological reality of Jesus' receptivity to the incarnation from the start. All right, Jesus had to agree to that deal. Jesus had to agree to be born among us. It's why we can ultimately say, this is the disabled God. God's very being is implicated in the vulnerability of the incarnation, and God relinquishes control by that identification. Further, as Powell dives into these heady waters, we find a call and response emanating from each person of the Trinity, expressing both gift and reception. They're always, we have the interconsession concept in theology. And that's what she's playing with here, what she's looking at here, that there is this constant love, concern, attention to what's going on in God as God's self and what's going on in God in the Imago Dei. Never far from us. Here is a God who is vulnerable, who receives true human existence into God's eternal being, and who risks true human response to the guidance of the Spirit. God's receptivity and vulnerability can be and likely is challenging to normate sensibilities. Kenosis is a difficult pill to swallow, a hard teaching about God's limits. Creamer's limits model unpacks this difficulty with the assertion that all human beings are dependent to some degree, whether physical, sensory, intellectual, emotional, and or spiritual or others. As I've argued, dependence is neither a bad word nor a bad idea. As I have argued, Iozzio here, have argued. The affirmation of people with disabilities must include recognition of diversity in creation, inclusive of the diversity across the spectrum of abilities, as well as the dependence that is the reality of all humankind upon the webs of relationship that begat, befriend, and support each and every one of us. When this dependence is associated with God, many shiver at the thought of God's vulnerability, even as they hold tight to the Trinity and the Incarnation. However, without recognizing the implications that God's enfleshment would necessarily include the common bodily experiences we all share, that, in Jesus' case, involved also the agony of the crucifixion. As Christians can attest, neither the agony nor the death of Jesus is the end of the story, even as dependency perdures. In the Trinity, in the Incarnation, and the Imago Dei in which each of us has been created, dependency perdures. As Eastland notes, the disabled God does not engage in a battle for dominance or create a new normative power. Rather, God is in the present social symbolic order at the margins with people with disabilities and instigates transformation from this de-centered position. Here is a resistance to heteropatriarchy upended in recognition of women, people with disabilities, and other marginalized identities. And what might the future bring to us, if not what we ourselves identify as good and right? When Powell turns to imagine futures as she considers yesterday's and today's work with hope and faith and love, our hope rests in God and in the promise that God is with us always and in all ways. As the disabled God revealed in Jesus retains the scars of the crucifixion, Eastland reminds us that the apostles recognized him by his voice to Mary of Magdala, by his breaking of the bread with the apostles, by his wounds to Thomas, and by his teaching on the road to Emmaus. We are invited to recognize him in our daily comings and goings, in the persons we meet in the street, in the playground, at work, at prayer, and in our homes and our families. Here we enter into Christ and enter it thereby into Yahweh's covenant, and this entry entails leaving behind racialized identities that whiteness creates. It's only identifying ourselves, as did Christ, as friends of God and prophets, are we to forge ahead in relationship and covenant with one another and in union with the crucified, risen God. For those who have been scarred, literally and figuratively, the marks that remain become part of our identities, our past, our present, our future selves, and others recognize us by these scars in the same way that Jesus was recognized in the wounds of the crucifixion. Thank you.